This is well, it's a bit of a presentation. What I'd like to do is say a couple of things, a bit about our particular research group, if I may, because everybody has actually taken part in this particular study. We tried to come up with an idea which everyone, given their different interests, might be able to have some input to in some kind of way. So right through from filling in the ethics form to distributing data to analysing, setting up Bristol Online Survey and all kinds of stuff, everyone's had a role to play. And so I'm very grateful to everybody in the team that's taken part and contributed to the research. Lots of things that our team are doing, and I know people will be embarrassed if I point to them. So, you know, I do like to embarrass people. So I'd just like to give a special mention to Claire Edge, whose paper from a PhD has just been accepted for publication. Well done, Claire. Really fantastic news. And I know quite a few other people are doing exciting things. Mike's involved in a project in Europe, which is very hush-hush. So if you heard me say those words, pretend you didn't hear them. And Sarah Vestergren, I know, is revamping the entire Swedish health system. They've been in touch with her to ask for her help to wipe out coronavirus in Sweden. So it's all pretty exciting stuff. And I know, Janine, you've been working hard with the with your particular stuff that you're doing, and Rod as well. Thank you all very much for those of you coming in. As you can hear, my style hasn't changed too much. I am flanneling, but the aim is just to give you a bit of a chance to get into the room, and thank you for coming. Brexit and your mental health. You might be thinking, as I am, well, here we go. Next slide. There we go. Are things really this bad? I guess the answer to that you will know yourself. And it probably doesn't have everything to do with Brexit. In fact, Brexit was so last year, you're probably thinking that I'd completely forgotten about it. Why should we bother? And I guess there are a few reasons why we probably should keep Brexit on our radar, even though we're all thinking coronavirus, coronavirus, coronavirus. The British Psychological Society got very excited about Brexit, so excited that it has no policy whatsoever to support people experiencing the negative effects of Brexit. That the BPS wishes to remain politically in the middle, which we can take an understanding view of. But they've been very happy to fund events and platforms for people to come together and to discuss what Brexit might be doing, what effects it might be having psychologically and otherwise. And I'd like to just take a moment to pay tribute to a number of people who've been involved in this, and including students of ours at Salford and also graduates as well. And some of you I know are listening right now. And Eve, who has been doing her undergraduate studies, was helping to organise the BPS student section last year and organised a seminar on Brexit at Media City, which Sharon Cohen, Yvette, Anne and myself were at. And the BPS as well allowed us to do a symposium called Brexit and Me at the annual conference last year. That was quite a big deal because they weren't accepting many symposia, but I was really delighted because I know Yvette and also Chris, one of our graduates, presented there. And this was all very exciting. We've, as you know, we've already been doing stuff on psychology of democracy, and Brexit was part of that. And in Birmingham, the British Psychological Society, we have our political psychology section with the PSA, that's the Political Studies Association, and we did a joint presentation there on compassion in politics because of Brexit and the kind of discourse it's been promoting. And another of our graduates, Liana Rose, presented there. So we're trying to create a sort of a community, I guess, which involves students and graduates as well as staff members, whether you're full-time or part-time hourly paid. And we hope that that's a useful thing to be doing. At this point, a shameless plug, and Claire, I hope you'll forgive me, I don't want to monopolise the book market in any way, but here is a picture of a cover of a book, which is something I've been involved in doing, and I'm really delighted because in it are contributions from people who are involved in political psychology, including a chapter by Yvette, who's produced her master's thesis as a chapter within this. So this is all pretty exciting, and that's coming out later this year. Coming back to sort of bigger political points, really, about Brexit and whether it in fact has some impact on coronavirus and what's happening these days. Welcome back, Gemma. I thought you'd done a runner on me. For those who are wondering how I know this, on the screen it tells me who's joined the session and who's left. And welcome, Leonie. Nice to see or hear you here as well. And I apologise if the mics have been silent and I'm talking to myself. It might be you've all left. I don't know. And I might just be talking to myself. But that's probably nothing unusual. What I'm saying, I suppose, is that Brexit is such an important issue that is heightened by what's happened with coronavirus. We know there are tragic consequences of what's happened. And I guess I want to, thank you, Lucy, you're very kind. I'm guessing what I want to do is to try and draw some parallels with the bigger political picture. Okay, our research group is involved on politics, but we're also particularly interested in how politics interacts with psychological factors. Before COVID-19 became an issue, many people were predicting a negative outcome from Brexit. And I should say that you might glean that I maybe lean one political way or another. I'm trying not to. I'm trying to be as objective as I can about this. And what we've been doing in editing the book on Brexit in the workplace is to weigh up evidence from economists as well as psychologists and behavioural scientists. It was clear that Brexit was going to have a negative impact according to most of the economic forecasters. There's a science called econometrics I've been learning, where people will weigh up the likely consequences. And Professor Imad Musa at the University of Melbourne is a bit of an expert on this. And he's been pointing out that actually there are relatively few economists who predicted that Brexit would have a positive economic forecast. And the reason we don't necessarily hear all that much about the negative stuff during some of the run-up to the Brexit referendum and subsequently is the government's choice of scientists and the government's choice of experts on whom they'd like us to focus. And you're going to start to see, I guess, some parallels with how Brexit came about and how Brexit has been dealt with and how coronavirus has been dealt with. The no-deal Brexit scenario, which is still very much a possibility following the December election, according to an article in The Lancet, very influential group of health experts there, Fahy et al. Have been kind of suggesting that actually a no-deal Brexit will have a terrible negative impact on the NHS. I guess we would all probably wouldn't be surprised by that. But if that does go ahead, if there is no time for negotiation because of all that's happened around the coronavirus, then, well, how will we actually end up with a deal? It becomes less and less of a likelihood, and an increasing likelihood of a no-deal Brexit, which means, guess what? An even bigger negative impact on the NHS, something we've been trying to avoid during this outbreak of the virus. We also know that demographically, the part of the population who supported the idea of Brexit and also tended to vote for the Conservative majority government as it is now have been older voters. And so there's some interesting aspects there of look at the impact of things on Brexit and indeed of the coronavirus in terms of the population. We also know as well, and again, this is an issue which is a huge issue, which I think was mentioned one or 2 or 3 days in the media, but then seemed to disappear again, was the impact of coronavirus on Black and minority ethnic groups. And not only have we got a disaster in terms of our population, but the preponderance of the impact on Black and minority ethnic groups, as well as in terms of income groups as well, is something we just haven't got to grips with yet, and is desperately needed. The determination of the government to pursue no deal is ideologically driven. One could say that how coronavirus was dealt with initially, certainly in its early stages, was also ideologically driven. The idea that Dominic Cummings was suggesting that we would lose a proportion of people, but we'd save the economy, was something we heard about in the media. But also from an ideological perspective, if you're on the Conservative side of the spectrum, then you'll tend not to want to intervene in things. And clearly, the government has had to change its perspective and implement policies it would never have dreamt of in the December run-up to the election. So what is it that we can expect? And what's happening with our mental health? And that's what I'd like to sort of turn next, if I may. But I've got some questions for you, and I want you to bear these in mind. And I'm not asking them from a party political viewpoint at all. I'm using government with a small g. Whether you support one side or another one indeed, are these things that you would expect? Would a government deliberately put its population in harm's way? Surely not. Surely this would never happen. At what point as a government would you intervene? Imagine you were the Prime Minister. At what point would you decide, crikey, that we can't go ahead like this, we'll have to do things differently? Welcome, Simon, nice to see you there. How important is saving face for the government as well? If you've been watching the daily briefings, you'll be hearing lots of discourse which is around what we have been doing and justifying how we have been doing it. It's very much the language of, well, we've done all right, actually, it's okay. And yet the statistics are very clear that as of today, the UK has the largest death toll from coronavirus of any European country. It's regardless of political persuasion at all, those are the numbers we're getting. What we're hearing in terms of discourse as well from the government is very much about things we're doing. We're working really hard to. You'll hear it, a phrase not just used by Boris Johnson, but by other government ministers as well. Other phrases like levelling up. Certain bits of language that have been introduced into the discourse around politics that suggest certainly there's a groupthink around how we're going to talk about certain things and how we're going to save political face. Question, did people get what they voted for? I guess I could leave for you to decide. So this is a photograph. I was lucky I was able to take this, and fortunately not everyone was looking, but you can see that some people in this photograph really thought Brexit was a great idea, and that possibly whoever was in charge of Britain at the time may have been a bit puzzled about what was going on and was learning about it from the Australian Prime Minister there. You may or may not choose to believe everything I tell you. So where does this leave us around mental health and Brexit? And this is a slide, and I apologize with lots of words on it. I don't normally put quite this many on, but I've got very excited because in the upcoming edition of The Psychologist, there is a big review article around mental health and the impact that Brexit may have had on people's mental health, calling it a Brexistential crisis. I've tried to put the link in there for those of you who are very excited and want to run off and read that, or indeed finding my voice so soporific that actually this might just put the seal on it. And what I've tried to identify here are issues for the phrase I've used there is EU citizens, but I'm talking about people who are originally from the EU and working or living in the UK, and may also be UK citizens as well at this point. But you can see a tranche of survey findings suggesting a number of negative outcomes, things that we might have anticipated perhaps, things that we know from some of the research that Yvette and other people have been doing shows the negative impacts that have been happening. If we knew these things were going to happen though, and perhaps it wouldn't have been too difficult to predict them, why is it the government has taken limited action to address them? Why is it some of the discourse around Brexit and potentially some of the discourse around coronavirus has been, well, we could probably have predicted what was going to happen next, but we haven't intervened? Is it ideological? Is it potentially even deliberate? Sam, thank you very much indeed. You've put a link up there. That's very exciting. These things keep coming up on my screen for those who are wondering what I'm on about. In terms of the general population, very interesting findings here from some very large-scale surveys as well. The Office of National Statistics, for example, which started to measure well-being under the David Cameron government, showing a decrease in Britain's average happiness, life satisfaction, and overall feeling that life is worthwhile from a survey of a third of a million people. Perhaps not surprising around the Brexit time, and how much of that's to do with the decision to leave the EU or because of the 3 years of wrangling might be hard to tell. There are a number of things going on. Thank you, Claire. You're very kind. We've also got measures like the General Health Questionnaire, which we use in the research slide. We'll get around to talking about, don't worry, in this particular survey. Again, showing that Remain voters experiencing higher psychological distress and a decreased level of symptoms amongst Leave voters. So perhaps, again, having some sense of control over things really does make a difference. In terms of the impact of political events on mental health, and obviously Brexit we can term as a political event, there's some mixed evidence about how this kind of might exert an influence. And we were drawing very heavily on the research by Chris Kaniasti, and Urbana Jakubowska in the United States, both Polish researchers originally, looking at how people perceive negative political events and whether that has an impact on their subjective well-being. And Chris and I were in conversation via email, and he was going to produce a chapter on this, but subsequently, unfortunately, withdrew because he said, actually, we've got this research, but we're now not sure whether the data stacks up. There's been a problem in how they'd analysed it, and so there's a bit of mixed evidence about whether the impact that which he predicted and which he thought he'd found really does exist. But from my own research on politicians, we do know that where levels of control are low, then psychological health will be low as well. And again, that's a finding which is repeated outside of politics. You don't need me to tell you that, I'm sure. But in terms of Brexit, research by Voss, again in the article that's in The Psychologist, it's cited in there, shows from analysing social media posts that the most frequent emotions being posted by EU citizens living in the UK are negative ones there. And you can see a range of things which, not surprisingly, speak very much to distress. So if we're going to do research in this area, as a group, we decided we need to look at emotions. We need to perhaps look at other things that are important here, like the perceived impact of political events. Perceptions of control would have been nice to put in there, but I guess there's a limit to how much you can measure in one survey, as I'm sure you all know. So just to give you a flavour of kind of where we're heading and how we've shaped up our research ideas here, another shameless plug for the book I mentioned earlier, but that notion of control linking to emotions, linking to political events, was something we've tried to capture in what we're doing here. And we've borrowed measures from Clark Goodwin and Whiteley, who are political scientists, rather more than psychologists, shall we say, looking at what actually impacted and decided people's decision to vote for Brexit or against it. And you can see a range of things here which they found in their research influence people's decision to vote as Remain or to vote Leave. And included in that, for example, there's emotions playing a big part in there. Again, did people want Britain to be part of the EU? How did they perceive the leader? Was this someone who was a strong leader? Are we going to go for someone who we quite like? These are factors which we know influenced the results here. And there's also the economic and immigration focused stuff around, costs, benefits, and all that kind of stuff. Of course, the event that I think possibly will stick in my memory, looking back on the time we are now with a Brexit lens as well as a coronavirus lens, is following the government's decision and guidance, I think in February, and someone may correct me, that people coming to this country from the EU to work should have a minimum income of around, well, it was 24,000 and upwards. Otherwise, they wouldn't be allowed in. Has really been thrown into stark focus. Perhaps it already had, but again, I'm trying to be objective as I can here, in stating that actually a flight bringing fruit pickers from Romania into the UK to pick a harvest that would otherwise have gone to waste at a time when there was a potential for a real food shortage has highlighted the potential for impact of Brexit in a way that some people had predicted before Brexit was decided, without the impact of a plague like coronavirus hitting the UK. Is it really such a good idea? Is, in the light of what's happened, Brexit something that should go ahead? It's not a question people want to ask again. People are sick and tired. They don't want to hear the discussion reopened. But can we afford to do what the government and maybe the people of this country have voted to do? It's a question that perhaps at some point people might want to reflect on. That's good, because when I tried that slide earlier, it didn't work like so much on my computer this morning. But here are some of the things that I've been floating. And as a group, we talked about maybe we could try and capture in measuring something to do with Brexit in a sample of people. And there's a picture there of people out on the streets of London. I understand the biggest protest was about 1 million people marching through London at one point. And you can see even William Shakespeare got a bit of coverage there. I don't know how he managed that. He's a talented chap. Anyway, what did we do? Well, we had the idea that, thank you, Claire, we had the idea that it would be really nice to have a repeated measures design, that we could assess people's well-being before Brexit happened and then catch up with them again after a decision had been made. And if it went ahead, we'd be able to compare people's well-being before and after. It sounded a dream of a design, you could say, an opportunity that doesn't often present itself in a real world situation. I'm only talking about the design being a dream, none of the rest of it, of course. What we discovered was that we could get large numbers of students to fill in the measure, people who attended our political conferences, and Yvette very helpfully set up the Sonar, not Sonar, it was Bristol Online Survey, wasn't it, Yvette? You did, and thank you very much for doing so, which got people filling those in. I know David Tate and Janine and Anne and Claire and Mike, you all helped gather data from paper sheets as well. So we had lots of people filling these things here. Fatima too, you were really helpful in that. And what we managed to get was a bit of data. What did we measure? We used the measure from Clark et al., the study I mentioned just a few moments ago. We thought we'd use Kaniasti and Jakubowska's as well, because the measures on there, the statements were all relevant. There were one or two we did have to adapt for Brexit purpose because it seemed prudent to do so, and it didn't really change too much of the layout. The emotions, which were part of a measure used by Clark et al., we thought we'd reuse those. And then there's a good old general health questionnaire, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, for measuring psychological stress. We had 92 people complete our measures. I should say, for whom we have data accessible. There is other data in a box in my office, which was something I was going to pick up on the next day I went into work. Fatima, I know you'll be annoyed with me because I know I said I'd do this before, and I apologize. I was well behind there. But we do have within that data a number of people, hopefully to base something indicative at least. We did ask people whether they consider themselves EU citizens or UK citizens or citizens from outside of the EU. And in itself, it was instructive how many people declared their citizenship. Because we had 67 people say, yeah, I'm a UK citizen. 6 people say, yeah, I'm an EU citizen. 19 people, 21% of our sample, did not declare their citizenship at all. Now that's quite interesting in one sense, because you'd imagine people are fairly aware of their citizenship. But was this perhaps more of a political statement, which is, well, I don't feel comfortable disclosing this. Will this be something used against me in some kind of way? And I wonder whether actually we're tapping into something which is another variable in conducting this kind of research. Age was something people were happier to share, and about a fifth of our sample were over 30. And again, I mention that because we know that age was an issue in terms of who supported Brexit and who didn't. Thank you very much indeed for bearing with me. I don't know if anyone has any questions at any point, but do raise a hand or whatever you want to. It's fine. Or if you've nodded off in the sunshine, I'm very envious of you, and I hope this is helping in some way. Just some example items here from political measures that we used. It just gives you a flavour of what we were trying to assess, really. And attitudes towards the EU, there was a Likert scale here, which had it was an okay alpha coefficient. It was fairly reliable. You can see what we're driving at there. The political events was as well. It taps into a range of things, and I'll talk more about those when we come to the results, but just to give you a flavour of what we were asking people. And it was all measured on Likert scales, strongly agree right down to strongly disagree or something equivalent. Initial results. Well, picked out just a few things here, but in terms of those who are over 30, now I do apologise for anyone who's over 30 listening to this presentation and seeing the word older being used in connection with them. This is in no way a slight, in any way, not intended at all. I myself am far older than 30, and 30 is just really young, and I don't want anyone getting upset about that. have I gone on enough about that? But the idea is that those who were older, thank you, Lucy, thank you, Claire. The idea that actually people who are older would tend to support Brexit wasn't the case in our sample. In fact, they were significantly, really, good heavens, they were significantly more positive about the EU the older they were. And that again says something about our sample, because obviously we're accessing a lot of students or people who are graduates. And one factor that came out again and again in research, political research about Brexit, thank you, Lucy. I think I probably missed mine in that case. Was that actually what's happening here? Sorry, it tickles me. These comments are coming up on my screen. It's very kind of you to suggest that. You've made me laugh there. But political research was showing that education was a key factor. And if people had been and done a degree and stayed in education, again, they were much more likely to favour the EU and to vote Remain. The citizenship issue, whether it was declared or not, didn't seem to make a difference. But again, with only 6 people saying they were EU citizens, this was a very small number. But the sample who didn't declare, it came close to significance in terms of differences around EU attitudes. But again, I won't dwell on that because it was a fairly small number again. But what were the emotions? Again, we have people saying yes or no. I was uneasy, I wasn't uneasy. And you can see here the key emotions coming through in this sample. And bearing in mind, we've seen in a previous slide how citizens of the EU feeling, then we know most of this sample would consider themselves UK citizens. These are the same kind of emotions coming through, regardless of whether you consider yourself British or European. And very small numbers saying they felt hopeful or positive in any way. What we tried to do, it was to kind of see, well, how much did these emotions play a role in people's psychological health and indeed in how they experience the whole Brexit phenomenon. Unease, which was the most frequently reported emotion, didn't produce any significant results when you compared those who did or didn't feel uneasy, whether you compare their attitudes towards the EU or indeed you looked at their measures of well-being. This is the general health questionnaire I mentioned earlier on. But when you got through to things like anger and fear, then this is where we started to find significant differences. So people who said, yes, I felt anger as a result of the Brexit decision or about what was going on, were significantly more positive in their attitudes towards UK membership of the EU. These were Remainers, these were not Leavers. However, there was no difference in GHQ or psychological well-being score, which suggests that it is entirely possible to feel an emotion without it necessarily affecting your longer-term well-being. And maybe that's something about how we experience emotions, and that psychological well-being is a longer-term plan, shall we say. But equally, I guess we were kind of expecting we might see some relationships there, and perhaps a bit surprised that anger and well-being weren't linked in some kind of way, at least negatively. In terms of those saying that they were afraid, and I characterize that as fear here, again, those were reporting that, yes, they did feel afraid about what was going on, were significantly more positive towards UK membership of the EU. In other words, the whole decision to leave had undermined their sense of what the future might hold, and clearly the uncertainty was impacting on them. What we tried to do then was to kind of see, well, okay, we're finding something here about anger and fear. These are significant results. Let's apply those to the statements from Kaniasti and Jakubowska's scale. And please don't ask me to keep repeating their name. I worked on 3 times in 45 minutes, and I haven't fallen over so far with them. But what we found here was comparing those who had or had not experienced anger, those who had or had not said they were afraid or experienced fear, and looked at some of the statements which perhaps related most to Brexit on the scale which assessed political events and how they felt those affected their well-being. And you can see, again, very clearly differences between those who were feeling fear in terms of the prospect of leaving the UK, leaving the EU. Anger was coming in there when you started to talk about Brexit. Politicians as liars is an interesting one, and I know we can have a whole discussion around whether we trust politicians or not, but clearly seeing behaviour of politicians over a 3-year period, I know will have made you feel a whole range of emotions, and that was the case certainly for our sample. More specific issues as well, around kind of not just political behaviour, but impact on the population. And again, amongst our student sample and sort of sample of adult graduates, we're seeing a lot of fear around the future in terms of how minority groups are being treated. And we didn't specify which minority groups as part of this, but just, I guess, a general fear around kind of, well, what is the future if you're not part of a majority group in some kind of way, which is some of the, I guess, some of the dialogue created around Brexit, which we'll come back to in a bit. Politicians' behaviour, politicians' attitudes towards the environment, for example, and the bottom one there, and obviously this was done before coronavirus, there was fear around the inability of the authorities to solve national healthcare issues. And I guess if we were able to repeat that measure now, we would see that going off the scale. The asterisks, by the way, I do apologise for not explaining. One asterisk indicates probability level at 0.05, 2 asterisks, the probability at 0.01, and 3 asterisks, you win on the slot machines if you get those. That's a really significant difference. So what is it we know as a result of doing this survey? Well, quite possibly it doesn't answer the question whether you should believe everything you read on the side of a bus, or answer one of those advertisements on the back around hair loss, as clearly I've been tempted to do, but I haven't gone ahead with yet. But I have found using this technology, I look even balder than I do in real life, but that's not important right now. What is it we really do know and understand? I think in terms of this research, clearly 92 people, a sample who we know have been involved in education, who are generally under 30 rather than over, however we might feel about that. There are some limited take-home messages I guess we can take. When I say what next, I suppose let me weave in my answer to what those messages might be into the future. Because our original idea, as you may recall, was that we would do a follow-up study. And indeed, we did ask people for an identifier on their online and paper questionnaire so that we could actually see, how they felt a few months down the line. And, well, we are not really in a position where we feel confident we can do that. Coronavirus has changed so much about well-being that if we were to repeat our measure, which is something we'd intended to do this spring, given that we left the EU as a country at the end of January, we wouldn't just be measuring the impact of Brexit. And so it might be that we will never know with this particular sample how much Brexit has affected people's well-being. But what we do know is that emotions have clearly played a major part in people's perceptions of the whole Brexit event and political events generally. Okay, it may well be that the emotions were already there, or have the emotions come afterwards? And that, I guess, is part of what future research needs to look at. Just what is the immediate impact of a political event? And how much do we see the political events actually affecting ourselves in such a way that we can be bothered to have an emotion about it? I guess you've all been watching the news, you've all been following particular things, and some of you will have been moved to throw things at the television, to shout at the Prime Minister, or shout at Matt Hancock, or whoever it is that's been put up in front of them, or even a so-called scientist, an actual scientist who's clearly an expert on how to get from one house that isn't theirs to their friends. What am I saying? Or follow their own advice. So we know that emotions are there, but how much does that then feed into our sense of well-being? How much does that affect our longer-term psychological health? I guess there are a number of factors, certainly we haven't captured in this, that will answer that question. Thank you, Maria. I guess some of the obstacles are clear there for a range of practical and methodological reasons, but some of the future research also needs to look around sort of comparing those inside and outside of education as well, because we know that was a major crux around which attitudes towards Brexit were evolved. In terms of looking at demographic groups based on citizenship, I would suggest also in terms of ethnicity, just as importantly, because we know again here that what's happened in terms of the dialogue around Brexit, and certainly in the run-up to it, and in the period of time since the more right wing in politics has been able to take hold of power and to work with it, is almost a legitimacy felt by some parts of society, more extreme right wing groups, shall we say, to voice what they feel and to feel that they can feel assured doing so and that they won't be jumped on too much. It's interesting when we kind of look at some of the dialogue, and that's not for now, I know, but around kind of extremism and what's perceived as extremism, a number of commentators are saying the real threat comes from the right wing of politics, and that has traditionally been the case. Sometimes it's more popular to focus on that, and sometimes it's not. And in a time when the whole country has shifted to the right, at least on average, this message doesn't always come through. Okay, the next thing I want to say, I won't talk for too much longer, is that David Frost, who many of you will remember was a TV political commentator of long standing, is not the same David Frost I'm talking about here, but actually was successful in carrying out a before and after study. Well, not so much before and after, but over a period of time, a longitudinal study looking at adult migrants living in the UK and their experience of psychological health, and looking at how their experience of psychological health was affected by living in a geographical location where people were generally leavers or generally remainers. And the idea behind Frost's research, I think, is very much that some of the dialogue and the feelings of security and safety were tapping into people's experience of well-being, particularly around anxiety and generalized anxiety symptoms you'll see here. So I've plagiarized some of what David Frost's abstract and detail of the article says to show that actually increased symptoms of anxiety were experienced where we're living in an area where actually people were perhaps more of the opposite political persuasion to yourself. What it does show, in a way that Kaniasti and Jakubowska couldn't be certain of, was a serious psychological effect of a major political event. And you might think, well, that doesn't necessarily have to be rocket science. It's not a major breakthrough. But actually designing and carrying out a study that will demonstrate that, as you can see from my description of our study, it's not without its challenges. So I was very relieved to find Frost's research, and it came out this year. I don't think it was a before and after Brexit, but certainly it's longitudinal, which is going to be one of the stronger designs for research in this area. Just a couple of things I guess I want to throw in from a theoretical perspective, and it was something that occurred to me quite a bit writing about Brexit in the workplace, and I'm afraid does relate to coronavirus as well, which is Stefan Hobford came up with a theory called conservation of resources theory back in the 1980s. And the idea that our psychological well-being is very much linked to access to things that will help our survival doesn't need to be rocket science, but what it does is predict a negative effect of psychological health where we perceive a threat to those resources. It's something we experience as soon as someone mentions potential job cuts or funding crisis. Immediately part of our brain goes to, well, I wonder if we'll still have a job in whatever industry I'm working in. And it applies to a whole host of things, including where you are in society and in your community, and around insecurities about what the future might hold, whether it's Brexit and the UK decision to leave the European Union, or indeed around coronavirus in terms of the many impacts that it's had and how it has highlighted and emphasized cracks in the society, which I guess we've always known are there, but haven't been addressed and have become even worse in these times. And again, I refer to some of the comments I made earlier as examples of that. It's not too much more I want to say, I guess, and you'll be relieved to hear. But I just want to sort of spend a couple of minutes summing up, if I may, and then open it up to questions, and you can throw things at me. But making sense of what happened, again, is a natural psychological process, and we're doing that now as we have been doing in relation to Brexit. There are a host of things we might have considered and we might want to look at as well, and not just the role of language, but also, again, our social and demographic backgrounds, our own particular beliefs, and whether people voted for or against Brexit based on their own situations. A friend of mine, I remember the evening they announced the Brexit result, was coming around for a meal, and my son rang up and said, "Dad, I can't believe what's happened." He's very much a Remainer, and And I said, yeah, it seems a surprise. I said, I'll tell you what, I'll give the phone to someone who might be able to tell you why they voted leave, because I knew my friend had voted leave. And I gave the phone straight to my friend Ian. And James said to him, why did you vote leave, Ian? And Ian said, I don't know. And perhaps there's something about making sense what doesn't make sense at all. That actually we make really important decisions in a way that suggests, well, I'm not sure my vote will count. Maybe no one's going to listen to me. Or maybe I've got something strong to say, and I'm going to find a way to do it, and this might be it. So how we make sense of these things from a research perspective probably needs to take into account a whole broad range of things. And I know there's a lot of initiatives now to try and make sense of coronavirus and how things reached the point they did, why this country wasn't as prepared as we know it could have been, why the toll of death here has been so much higher and so much higher in certain parts of our community as well. And just as importantly, what on earth are we going to do about that? I've been back into my history books in the last couple of weeks to see what happened the last time we had something called a plague. And I know this is an emotive topic, and I'm sorry for using this term. It's one that they're not using in the media, and I know I'm probably going out on my extreme. Page, do shut me down if I'm upsetting anyone. But the idea of something that is a killer of human beings that we don't know anything about and can't do much about isn't no new to our species. Back in 1665, the Great Plague, then as it was called, disrupted things for a good 18 months. In fact, Isaac Newton, who was attending Cambridge University at the time, had to suspend his studies for 18 months and had to do all his classes online, which was, you know, thank you, Lucy. I'm glad that's the case, not just yours as well. But the point, I suppose, is that kind of we come across these things as a species, and we're inclined to, I guess, just focus on the last couple of 100 years. What we're experiencing now is very much a species. It's in the memory of our species, even if it isn't in the memory of ourselves or a previous generation. The flu of 100 years ago was something different in a way. At least we knew that seasonally it would die out. We don't know that this is the case with coronavirus. So this whole notion of making sense is really important. It's really important for us as individuals living through it. It's really important for trying to do research into this matter as well. I guess there was perhaps another slide around Brexit I wanted to share with you. There are other slides on here, and I'm happy to share these with you as you want. I'm just looking now to see, I guess, yes, there was something here around prejudice and bigotry, which I was referring to earlier, and it was just a slide there. I wanted, however, to end with a couple of pictures, if I may. And there, ladies and gentlemen, is the reason why no presentation is complete without Noel Edmonds. I know it's been a long time since the hairdo was invented, but naturally I'm jealous of that. But, is there something about having a sort of TV star involved in a presentation that makes it work even better? I leave it for you to decide. There's a question there, how many Brexit ministers does it take to change a light bulb? It's right up there with the questions, how many managers does it take to decide how long an exam should be? And a few of you will know what I mean when I refer to that. But here, looking back, is kind of what happens when you get two political leaders who reckon they can sort things out. But politics, just like relationships, means things can go, well, awry a little bit. And I suppose people will look back on those moments and wonder, what on earth did happen? I've no pictures of any other prime ministers to show you, I'm afraid, of this country, except to suggest that maybe game theorists have a lot to say about the psychology of deal or no deal, not just Noel Edmonds. And there's some few words there that might, some of you who are aficionados of game theory will suggest, well, that's not what it's all about. But I guess the idea that deal or no deal, all or nothing, is a game we like to play, perhaps with our children, maybe when we're playing Monopoly or some other game, or Tiddlywinks, or even cards down the casino for those of you who do that. Is that something you would do with a whole country? Is it really possible the government would play, or any government would play, some kind of game with the future, not just you, but of everyone you represent, your community, your whole society? I guess we'll find out. Thank you so much for listening. I'm sorry it's been a one-way traffic, but I'm hoping now we can open the floor. Thank you very much indeed, everybody.
Cool, Ashley.
Thank you, Claire. You're very kind. You're very kind of me. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Lucy. Thanks, Fatima, Mike, Maria.
Indeed. Thank you, Ashley. We got anybody with questions who wants to jump in?
Yes, please do. Open it up, Sam. I can see there's lots of comments, and unfortunately, I couldn't read those while I was talking. So if I've missed something, I do apologise. But
I don't believe so. Well, I have a bit of a question for you, though it might be beyond the scope of your thinking, really, which is
most things are.
while you were talking, I was thinking about the role that the media plays in this, and things like you mentioned, of course, the UK reaching the highest death toll in Europe, which I must admit I've been somewhat detached from the news and things, but it's not in the upper stories on the BBC today. It was reported yesterday, from what I can find. I'm thinking about these things in combination with, we've got surveys finding that the UK press is the least trusted in Europe as well. I just wondered what thoughts you have about the role that the media plays in maintaining the image of the government and protecting well-being. It seems like there's some ethical questions there about, should they be presenting all information? Should they be presenting information in a way to protect our well-being in order to, thoughts?
Yes, yeah, no, I know what you mean. I will answer that question. I'd just like to thank everybody, because I know some people may be heading off. Thank you so much for your kind words, everybody. Thank you so much for attending. This is a really interesting question. It's one I've been going through my mind, is just how much information do you share with people, particularly when it might exacerbate, a mental health crisis, which is what we're in. And I think the issue there is possibly freedom of the press and freedom of the media in a so-called democratic society means that actually there's a public need to know motivator that pushes the media always to kind of look at these things and always to want to share it with people. But equally, in a 24/7 news media situation that we have, I do think there's a case where media are trying to fill the time. They are obviously consider themselves key workers. Have you noticed how reporters could go anywhere they wanted, even into homes, even use PPE that we have a shortage of? So they obviously consider themselves hugely important in this. And we could say, yes, there was a public interest in being able to see the inside of an intensive care unit. At least they did sort of, put fog around the face of an individual receiving care. But was it really necessary? And I think that's what's driven it, is there is a huge media industry. It's the only industry which has arguably benefited without condition in both Brexit and in coronavirus, because that's what seemed to dominate the news media altogether. It's very hard to get very much about anything else unless you go and buy a newspaper, in terms of what's on television. I realise I'm talking about television media and social media as well, but I think that issue around kind of what do we share is vitally important. And I don't think there's an easy answer in a democratic system. We do know in a non-democratic system, I take China as an example here, that initially they thought, crikey, stop that doctor speaking to anyone. Don't let him say anything about that new virus that we think is called COVID-19. In fact, arrest him and perhaps maybe silence him. I'm sure that's not what the government did, but it stopped news coming out, which we could all have done with. So there's two sides to the coin, really. But I do think there's an element of which emotions are being played by the media. And emotions are being played by the media. And that what that means is sometimes the media is just sort of wallowing in things to a certain extent. And there's a fine line to be drawn there. I love watching Colonel Tom. I'm sure you all have. In fact, I might sing We'll Meet Again or some other, or You'll Never Walk Alone if you like. Perhaps we could have a chorus in a few moments' time. But I don't know if that sort of half answers your question, Sam. What do you think?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's interesting you do raise that kind of idea that the media is almost exclusively profiting from crises and maintaining the emotions that might be detrimental to us is kind of key to their business. it's an interesting thought. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. So Lucy and Rod have posted a couple of comments. Lucy, you're asking about well-being and how this will be affected as coronavirus continues, and what role employers can play in this, and indeed the government. In fact, all of us. These are the big questions, really. I think, and there's lots of calls for research to find out what we can do. I know, Linda, you've been involved in pulling people together, and Sarah as well. It's a very good question. I think in employment situations, I think well-being will be greatly influenced by how caring we think our employers are, and how obvious it is that our employers not necessarily focused on whether we are still here in a year's time, but on whether the industry, the organization continues. And I think organizations, employers will have to tread very carefully in demonstrating to the people who work for them and to citizens as well, what exactly is being prioritized. It was interesting listening to, I think it was the World Bank representative a couple of weeks ago, who suggested there is no economic survival without well-being. And that's a message that you don't need to convince some countries of. But the UK is a country where traditionally it's been very hard to win that argument. And one potential downside of Brexit is the impact on whether the UK remains part of European initiatives around employee well-being. So I know that doesn't answer all your points, Lucy, but Rod has a question here too about sort of people in the study, whether they declare themselves as UK or EU citizens. Of course, people can consider themselves to be both. We did cover that eventuality, Rod, by just how it was phrased, and I have summarised on the slide there. But we did specify that EU brackets non-UK citizen. And when we were talking to people in the descriptions, we tried to say, well, if you could categorise yourself as one or other, that would be the case. But I take your point, that could well have muddied the water. So thank you very much.
So I've had some comments from Mike and Sarah on the media. Mike's comment on the panic buying behaviour is probably quite accurate, as
Yes.
It seemed to be almost the media that drove a lot of the panic buying and the toilet paper fiascos.
Yeah, I understand we have one or two colleagues who have been stockpiling this for many years, anticipating this very thing. I won't out anybody in that regard. But yes, as soon as you make something public like that, it becomes a thing, doesn't it? And I think you're right, Mike, that indeed is what happened there. So I'm not sure. I think we seem to have come through some of those initial stages of the panic. And I guess if there is extreme emotion like panic, it's also around distress as well. I think our main challenge at the moment, as there is talk of lifting restrictions and allowing people to move, is that this virus, very much like every other plague we've ever had, is no respecter of what would be nice for society to get on and do and what would suit the economy. It will strike however it can, and I don't mean to sound that as dramatic. It's the nature of a virus. I don't know a huge amount about them, but I remember studying them as an undergraduate, and they are fascinatingly well designed to do what they do. They almost look like the little outer space things in terms of how they can sort of hook on and inject stuff and mutate the DNA within cells. It's astonishing. So I do think we have a real challenge in terms of how we match what we see in society with what will finish this virus off. I'm interested that New Zealand are suggesting they've conquered the virus and that no one's caught it, so therefore it's dead. I wonder how true that can be.
I suppose that depends on how long they limit movement for and things.
Yes. Yeah. I guess I'd like to say we're very lucky in a university setting in that, traditionally the quiet time, unless you're perhaps in nursing or one of those occupations, that it is coming, and in the autumn it might buy us time before we have to go back into a workplace, or maybe we just don't. I don't know.
That seems like it could be a whole other thing.
So tune in next week.